Every fortress has a throne room. Most have a man who sits in it and calls himself powerful. Ravenshire has something different. Ravenshire has Lucian Blackthorn, a duke who never needed to raise his voice because silence did the work for him. The nobles of the eastern lowlands sent their complaints in perfumed envelopes. He sent them back unopened. The merchant guilds requested audiences through proper channels. He granted them when it suited his schedule, which was almost never. And when the old Viscount Hargrove attempted a backroom alliance to undermine Blackthorn grain tariffs, Lucien didn't retaliate with soldiers or sanctions. He simply attended Hargrove's winter banquet, sat at the man's own table, and spent 3 hours dismantling every financial arrangement the Viscount had built over 2 decades, all through polite dinner conversation. Hargrove resigned his seat on the Trade Council by morning. Nobody questioned why. If you're still here, stay until the end. Because what happened next didn't just change the Dominion, it changed the man who ruled it. The morning Lucian Blackthorn received the document, he was standing at the easternmost window of the war room, watching a supply caravan negotiate the switchback roads below. His steward, Edmund Graves, had placed the sealed envelope on the map table 20 minutes earlier and retreated to the doorway without a word. Edmund had served 3 generations of Blackthorns. He understood the architecture of the Duke's moods better than most men understood their own children. And right now, the architecture said, "Do not speak first." Lucien turned from the window. He was 34 years old and looked like a man who had been carved from the same granite that held his fortress together. Broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed, with dark hair cut close enough to suggest military discipline even though he had never formally served. His eyes were the problem. Not the color, a cold, unremarkable gray, but the way they processed information. Most men looked at a room and saw furniture. Lucien looked at a room and saw leverage. He picked up the envelope, broke the seal, read the contents once, then read them again. Edmund, Your Grace, this covenant, how long has it been in the lower archives? Decades, Your Grace, since before your father's tenure. And no one thought to bring it forward? The archivist classified it under dormant obligations. It was never flagged for review. Lucien set the document down. His jaw tightened. The thing about Lucien Blackthorn that nobody outside his inner circle understood was this. The anger never showed on the surface. It went somewhere deeper. It settled into his posture like frost settling into stone, invisible until something cracked. A dormant obligation, he repeated, to house and protect the surviving heir of the Vale bloodline, and this obligation activated upon the death of Lord Marcus Vale. Lord Vale died 9 years ago, Your Grace. 9 years. Lucien's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made Edmund shift his weight from one foot to the other. For 9 years, this house has been in default of a sworn covenant, and the woman who should have been brought here has been... Where, exactly? Edmund hesitated. The preliminary inquiry suggests she was placed in the care of extended family, a maternal cousin, Lady Constance Devereux. Devereux? Lucien said the name like he was tasting something spoiled. The woman who married into the Ashford banking fortune and spends half the year in their lake estate pretending she earned it. The same, Your Grace. Lucien turned back to the window. The caravan had cleared the second switchback. He watched it for a long time without seeing it. Bring her here. Lady Devereux? Lady Vale. Edmund paused. Your Grace, the diplomatic complications... Did I ask you about complications? No, Your Grace. Then don't offer them. Send the formal summons under the Covenant's enforcement clause. If Devereux resists, remind her that obstructing a Blackthorn covenant carries forfeiture penalties that would make her husband's bankers very nervous. He paused. And Edmund, find out why this document was buried. I want to know who touched it, who filed it, and who decided it didn't matter. Edmund bowed and left. The door closed with the particular kind of silence that only occurs in rooms where something irreversible has just been decided. Lucien stood alone in the war room. He picked up the covenant again and studied the signature at the bottom. Lord Marcus Vale's handwriting was precise, careful, almost elegant, the handwriting of a man who understood that documents outlast the people who signed them. Beneath it, in the heavier ink of the Blackthorn seal, his own father's signature. A promise made between two men who believed their houses would honor the words long after both of them were gone. And someone had made sure that promise disappeared. The thing about power that most people never grasp is that it doesn't corrupt because it offers temptation. It corrupts because it offers isolation. Lucian had learned this before his 20th birthday. Watching his father govern Ravenshire with the precision of a man playing chess against opponents who hadn't realized the game had started. The old duke never explained his strategies. He simply executed them, and anyone paying attention either learned or didn't. Lucien had paid attention. He had learned that vulnerability was a structural weakness, that trust was a calculated risk, and that the only reliable constant in aristocratic politics was self-interest. These lessons had made him effective. They had also made him something he rarely examined, profoundly alone. He didn't think about that now. He thought about the forged filing markers on the Covenant's archival sleeve, the deliberate misdating that had sent it into a classification dead zone where it would never surface through normal review. Someone with access to the Blackthorn archives had committed a very specific act of sabotage, and Lucien Blackthorn did not tolerate sabotage. She arrived 11 days later. The weather had turned. A cold front from the northern highlands had swept across Ravenshire, dragging sheets of rain across the fortress walls and turning the approach road into a muddy obstacle course. Lucien watched from the upper gallery as the carriage pulled through the main gate. A modest vehicle, not the ornate conveyance a woman of noble blood should have been traveling in. No escort, no outriders, no Devereux banner. Just a single carriage, rain-soaked and road-battered, stopping in the courtyard like an afterthought. The footman opened the door. A woman stepped out. From the gallery, Lucien could see enough. She was perhaps 25, slender, wearing a traveling coat that had been well made once, but now showed the kind of wear that comes from being the only good coat someone owns. Her hair was dark, cut short in a way that looked wrong. Not a fashionable style, but something cruder, something done quickly and without care. Like someone had taken shears to it the way you'd cut rope. She stood in the rain for a moment. She didn't hunch against it. She didn't rush toward the doorway. She simply stood, looked up at the fortress towering above her, and squared her shoulders with the particular kind of deliberation that told Lucien everything Edmund's preliminary report had not. This was a woman who had been systematically reduced, and she knew it, and she had come anyway. "Your Grace," Captain Aldrich Voss, head of the fortress guard, appeared at his shoulder. "The carriage has no Devereux seal. The driver says he was hired independently, paid in advance, with instructions to deliver and leave." "Paid by whom?" "He doesn't know. The arrangement was made through a third party in the market town." Lucien's eyes didn't leave the woman in the courtyard. She had picked up her single travel case and was walking toward the entrance without waiting for anyone to guide her. "Interesting," Lucien said, and he meant it. The receiving hall of Blackthorn Keep was designed to intimidate. 40-foot ceilings, walls lined with ancestral portraits arranged not by chronology, but by strategic importance. The Blackthorns who had expanded the Dominion's borders placed highest, their painted eyes gazing down on anyone entering their domain. The floor was polished obsidian, black as still water, reflecting torchlight in ways that made visitors feel exposed from every angle. Seraphina Vale stood in the center of it and didn't flinch. Lucien descended the main staircase slowly. He was aware of the effect, the theatrical authority of a man emerging from the upper darkness into the torch-lit receiving hall. He'd used it hundreds of times. It worked on ambassadors, on merchants, on rival nobles who thought their bloodlines entitled them to eye-level conversations. It didn't seem to work on her. She watched him approach. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black in the torchlight, and they tracked his movement with an attentiveness that wasn't nervous. It was analytical. She was reading him the same way he was reading her. "Lady Seraphina Vale," he said. "Duke Blackthorn." Her voice was steady, controlled, not warm, not cold, the voice of someone who had learned to give away nothing until she understood the terrain. "You've had a long journey." "I've had worse." He stopped 6 feet from her, close enough to be personal, far enough to maintain the formality that protocol demanded. "I imagine you have questions," he said. "Several hundred." A pause. "But I suspect you have more." Something shifted in Lucien's expression. Not a smile. He didn't offer those to strangers, but a fractional adjustment, the way a predator recalibrates when it encounters something unexpected. "Edmund will show you to your quarters. We'll speak tomorrow after you've rested. I'd rather speak now. He studied her. The short hair, the worn coat, the travel case gripped in fingers that were white-knuckled despite the steady voice. She was exhausted and scared and standing in a fortress she'd never seen before, facing a man whose reputation was built on being unapproachable, and she wanted to talk now. All right, he said. Walk with me. He led her through the east corridor toward the library. The servants they passed averted their eyes. Habit, not instruction, though Lucien had never corrected it. Serafina walked beside him without adjusting her pace, which told him she wasn't trying to follow or keep up. She was walking at her own speed and letting the geography sort itself out. Lady Devereux, Lucien began, was your guardian for 9 years. Guardian is a generous word. What word would you use? Serafina was quiet for a few steps. Warden, she said finally. Lucien absorbed that. Explain. I was kept, fed, housed, technically educated, but everything that connected me to my father's name was dismantled. His correspondence was confiscated. His personal effects were sold or stored where I couldn't reach them. I was told the estate debts consumed everything, that there was nothing left, that I should be grateful for the charity I was receiving. She paused. I was 15 when I stopped believing that. And you didn't leave? And go where? The question wasn't self-pitying, it was mechanical. A woman with no verified inheritance, no social connections, and a guardian who controlled every document proving my identity. Where exactly was I supposed to go? They reached the library. Lucien opened the door himself, a gesture so unusual that any member of the household who witnessed it would have discussed it for weeks. The library was enormous, filled with volumes that spanned centuries of Blackthorn scholarship and intelligence gathering. Serafina entered and stopped. Not because of the books, because of the portrait above the central fireplace. 2 men standing side by side, one with the angular features of the Blackthorn line, the other with the softer jawline and thoughtful eyes that Serafina clearly recognized. Your father, Lucien said, watching her face. And mine. She didn't speak. Her hand tightened on the travel case. They were close, Lucien continued, closer than most aristocratic alliances. The covenant your father signed wasn't a political convenience. It was a personal guarantee. He trusted my father to protect you if he couldn't. And your father? My father died 4 years after yours. The covenant should have been activated and honored immediately. It wasn't. Why? Because someone made sure it wouldn't be. The silence that followed was heavy enough to have physical weight. Serafina set her travel case down slowly, and when she looked at Lucien, the controlled composure had cracked just enough to show what was underneath. Not weakness, but a fury so tightly compressed it had become structural, load-bearing, the thing that held her upright when everything else had been stripped away. Who? She asked. I don't know yet. But you intend to find out. It wasn't a question. Lucien noted that. I intend, he said, to correct a failure that occurred under this house's authority. Your father trusted mine. That trust was betrayed. I will not allow that betrayal to stand. Serafina studied him. Her eyes moved across his face with an intensity that most people reserved for reading legal contracts, searching for the clause that would undo everything the preceding language promised. And if the answer implicates people you'd rather protect? There is no one in this dominion I would protect at the expense of this house's word. That's a large statement. I'm a large problem for anyone who tests it. Something shifted between them. Not warmth. Neither of them dealt in warmth as a primary currency. But recognition. The particular kind of recognition that occurs when 2 people who have learned to survive through vigilance realize they are standing in front of someone who operates on the same frequency. Get some rest, Lucien said. Tomorrow, we begin. Begin what? Taking back everything that was stolen from you. She picked up her travel case. At the doorway, she turned. Duke Blackthorn. Lady Vale. I don't trust you. You should know that. Good. Trust is earned through evidence, not titles. I intend to provide the evidence. She left. Her footsteps faded down the corridor, and Lucien stood alone in the library beneath the portrait of 2 dead men whose promise had been deliberately broken. He poured himself a measure of whiskey from the cabinet by the window. He didn't drink it. He held the glass and looked at the amber liquid and thought about a woman who had been systematically erased for 9 years and had survived it not through hope, but through a controlled structural rage that she had learned to wear like architecture, invisible from the outside, holding everything together from within. Survival was not about endurance. Lucian understood that better than most. Survival was about deciding which version of yourself would emerge from the damage and then building that version deliberately, brick by brick, in the dark, where nobody could see the construction. He drank the whiskey. It burned. He poured another. By midnight, he was in the archives. The lower archives of Blackthorn Keep occupied 3 underground chambers connected by narrow stone corridors lit with oil lamps that cast shadows on walls stacked floor to ceiling with documents. Lucien had always found the archives clarifying. There was something honest about paper. It could be forged, misfiled, or destroyed, but it couldn't lie the way a human face could. Paper recorded what happened. People recorded what they wanted others to believe had happened. He pulled the Covenant from its filing sleeve and examined the archival markings again. The classification stamp read, Dormant. Periodic review suspended. The suspension date was listed as 16 years ago, 3 years before Lord Marcus Vale's death. Someone had preemptively buried the document, not after the obligation was triggered, before it. Lucien sat back in his chair. The lamplight caught the angles of his face, the hard jaw, the sharp cheekbones, the calculating gray eyes that were now doing what they did best, processing, connecting, building the architecture of someone else's deception from the structural evidence they'd left behind. 3 years before Vale died. That meant someone had known, or anticipated, that Lord Marcus Vale would not survive to enforce the Covenant himself, and that someone had access to the Blackthorn archives at a level that required either direct family authority or the complicity of the head archivist. He checked the archivist records. 16 years ago, the head archivist had been a man named Cornelius Thatch. Thatch had served the Blackthorn household for 22 years before retiring to a small estate in the southern province, a generous pension. Unusually generous. Lucien made a note of the pension amount and the date it was authorized. Then he pulled the financial records for the corresponding period. What he found made him set the ledger down very carefully. The pension had not been authorized by his father. It had been authorized by the household comptroller under a discretionary fund that technically required only a senior administrator's signature. The comptroller at the time was a man named Gerald Ashwick. Ashwick had left the Blackthorn household service 12 years ago and now worked. Lucien checked the personnel records twice to make sure he was reading correctly, as a financial consultant for the Devereux family's banking interests. The architecture of the deception was becoming visible. He spent 3 more hours in the archives, pulling financial records, personnel files, and correspondence logs. By the time he climbed back to the upper floors, he had a preliminary map of the conspiracy. Not complete, not yet actionable, but clear enough to understand its shape. The Covenant had been buried deliberately. The archivist had been paid to reclassify it. The man who authorized the payment had subsequently gone to work for the family that had taken custody of Seraphina. And Lady Constance Devereux, the woman who had called herself Seraphina's guardian for 9 years, had connections to at least 3 noble families who would have benefited from the Vale inheritance remaining unclaimed. Lucien stood in the corridor outside his chambers. The fortress was silent. The particular deep silence of a stone building in the hours between midnight and dawn, when even the walls seemed to hold their breath. He thought about Seraphina Vale standing in the rain, looking up at his fortress with squared shoulders and a single travel case. A woman who had been erased by people who calculated that she would never have the resources or connections to discover what had been done to her. They had bet on her powerlessness. They had bet on the Blackthorn Covenant staying buried forever. They had bet wrong. Captain Voss was waiting outside the war room when Lucien arrived at dawn. The soldier was accustomed to the Duke's irregular hours and had long since stopped being surprised by summons that arrived before sunrise. Voss, 2 things. Your Grace. First, I want a full security detail on Lady Vale. Discreet but comprehensive. If anyone approaches her quarters without authorization, I want to know about it before they reach the door. Voss nodded. And the second? Send word to our agents in the Devereux financial network. I want every transaction involving the Vale estate from the last 15 years. Every property sale, every debt settlement, every transfer of assets, all of it. That's going to attract attention, Your Grace. I'm counting on it. Voss studied his duke. 20 years of military service had taught him to recognize the difference between strategy and anger. Right now, Lucien Blackthorne was operating in both registers simultaneously, and that combination was the most dangerous configuration Voss had ever witnessed in the man. Understood, Your Grace. One more thing, Lucien paused. The archives. I want the access logs for the past 20 years. Every name, every entry, every document pulled. And Voss, this stays between us. Not Edmund, not the council, not anyone. If someone in this household was part of the cover-up, I need to identify them before they know I'm looking. Voss saluted and left. Lucien turned to the map table. The war room was designed for military campaigns, so enormous cartographic displays, strategic models, supply line projections. But the war Lucien was about to fight wouldn't be won with soldiers. It would be won with information, with patience, and with the particular kind of ruthless precision that made powerful men regret ever entering his field of vision. He spread the documents he'd gathered across the map table and began constructing the timeline. Serafina found him there 4 hours later. She had changed from her traveling clothes into a simple dark dress that must have been provided from the household's guest provisions. Her short hair was combed back from her face, and in the daylight streaming through the war room's high windows, Lucien could see the details he'd missed the night before. A thin scar along her left jawline, almost invisible. Hands that were calloused in ways that suggested manual work, not the soft hands of a noblewoman who had been properly cared for. And her eyes, awake, alert, cataloging everything the way a person catalogs escape routes. "You've been here all night," she said. "I don't require much sleep." "That's not what I asked." He looked up. She was standing in the doorway with the same posture she'd held in the courtyard, squared shoulders, weight balanced, ready to move in any direction. Not combative, just prepared, always prepared. "Yes," he said. "I've been here all night." She stepped into the room, her eyes moved across the map table, the spread documents, the financial records, the personnel files, the timeline he'd been building with the same methodical intensity other men brought to military campaigns. "What is all this?" "The beginning of an answer to your question from last night." "Which question?" "Who?" Serafina moved closer. She picked up one of the financial records and read it with a speed that told Lucien she had been educated in ways that Lady Devereux probably hadn't intended. "These are pension authorizations from your household comptroller." She set the paper down and picked up another. "Cross-referenced with Devereux employment records." She looked at him. "You're mapping a conspiracy." "I'm identifying a structure. Conspiracies sound dramatic. What happened to you was administrative, bureaucratic. Someone reclassified a document. Someone authorized a payment. Someone hired a compromised official. All of it perfectly deniable if you only look at individual actions. But together, it tells a story. And the story says your father's death wasn't just an opportunity for Lady Devereux. It was anticipated, planned for. The covenant was buried 3 years before your father died." Serafina went very still. 3 years before, she repeated, which means either someone predicted his death with remarkable accuracy, or they had reason to know it was coming. The air in the room changed. Lucien watched her face, the micro-expressions that flashed across her features like a complex weather system. Shock, calculation, fury, and then something cold and precise that replaced all three, something that settled behind her eyes like a door closing and locking. "My father's death was ruled accidental," she said. Her voice was flat, operational. The voice of someone who had just reorganized their entire understanding of their own history and was already building the new architecture. "I'm aware of the ruling." "And you think it was wrong?" "I think the timing deserves investigation." She stood across the map table from him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The war room held the silence between them. Two people who had independently built themselves into fortresses, standing across a table covered in evidence that someone had engineered the destruction of an entire bloodline. "I want to see everything," Serafina said. "You'll see everything." "No." She placed both hands flat on the table. "Not the version you edit for my benefit. Not the diplomatic summary. Everything. Every document. Every connection. Every suspicion." If my father's death was manufactured, I have a right to see the evidence without a filter. Lucienne held her gaze. Most people couldn't sustain eye contact with him for more than a few seconds. Serafina Vale held it without effort, and in that sustained look, he saw something that simultaneously impressed and disturbed him. She was not asking for protection. She was claiming a seat at the table, and she was doing it with the natural authority of someone who had always belonged there, even when the world had spent 9 years telling her otherwise. Everything, he confirmed. She nodded once. Then she pulled a chair to the table, sat down, and began reading. They worked in silence for 2 hours. Lucien didn't fill the silence with explanations or reassurances. He didn't perform the theater of competence that most powerful men defaulted to when they wanted to impress. He simply worked, and Serafina worked beside him, and the two of them built the map of the conspiracy together in the quiet, focused way of two people who understood that the truth was not a gift someone handed you. It was a structure you built from evidence, piece by piece, in the harsh light of documents that didn't care about your feelings. By noon, the map was significantly more detailed. By noon, Serafina had found the first connection Lucien had missed. This name, she pointed to a correspondence log entry, Aldous Crane. He witnessed the inventory assessment of my father's estate after the death. The same Aldous Crane appears here, she slid another document forward, as an investor in a land acquisition that transferred Vale territory to a holding company registered in the Ashford Banking Consortium. Lucien leaned forward. Where did you find the land acquisition record? Third box, bottom of the second stack. Misfiled under trade permits. Misfiled. Or hidden where someone assumed no one would look. He studied the connection. She was right. The intersection was clear. A man who had assessed the Vale estate's value had then profited from the sale of Vale land. It was a thread, and it connected to the larger structure with the precision of an engineering joint. Good eye, he said. It was the highest compliment in his vocabulary. Serafina didn't smile. She didn't need the validation. She just set the documents in order and kept reading. At 3 in the afternoon, Edmund appeared in the doorway with a sealed message. His expression, carefully neutral in the way that told Lucien the news was not good, made both of them look up simultaneously. Your Grace, an envoy from the Devereux household has arrived at the gate. Lady Constance requests the immediate return of Lady Vale to her custody. She claims the covenant enforcement is legally deficient and that Blackthorn has no authority to compel Lady Vale's residence. The room went cold. Not the temperature. Something else. Something in the way Lucien rose from his chair with a slowness that was more threatening than speed. The way his hands flattened on the table with a precision that suggested he was preventing them from forming fists. She claims, Lucien said softly, that I have no authority. Those are the envoy's words, Your Grace. Serafina stood. Her face was white, but her voice was steady. She'll have lawyers. She always has lawyers. The Ashford money buys the best. Sit down. Lucien's voice cut through hers. Not harsh, not angry, something worse. The absolute certainty of a man who had just been given a target. She sat. Lucien straightened. He adjusted his coat. He looked at Edmund with an expression that the steward would later describe to Captain Voss as the most unsettling thing he'd witnessed in 30 years of Blackthorn's service. Bring the envoy to the receiving hall, Lucien said. And Edmund, make sure every member of the household staff is present to witness what happens next. He moved toward the door. At the threshold, he turned back to Serafina. Stay here. Read every document on that table. When I return, I'll need you to tell me everything you've found. What are you going to do? Lucien Blackthorn looked at her with eyes that had gone from gray to something darker, something that belonged in the architecture of the fortress itself. Stone and iron, and the accumulated weight of every man who had ever built power from nothing, and refused to see it dismantled by smaller hands. I'm going to remind Lady Devereux, he said, what it costs to challenge this house. He left. And Serafina Vale sat alone in the war room of Blackthorn Keep, surrounded by the evidence of her own destruction, and for the first time in 9 years she felt something she had systematically forbidden herself from feeling. Not hope. Hope was a vulnerability she couldn't afford. Something worse. The terrifying structural certainty that the most dangerous man in the Dominion had just declared war on her behalf. and that the people who had spent 9 years dismantling her life had absolutely no idea what was coming. The doors of the receiving hall opened, and everything that happened next would change Ravenshire forever. The envoy was a thin man with expensive boots and the rehearsed posture of someone who had been told exactly what to say and precisely how to say it. He stood in the center of the receiving hall with a leather folio pressed against his chest like a shield, and when the doors opened and Lucian Blackthorne walked in, the man's left eyelid twitched. Just once. But Lucian saw it, and he cataloged it the way he cataloged everything, as data, as leverage, as the first hairline fracture in a structure he intended to bring down. The household staff lined the walls. Edmund had arranged them in full formal configuration: footmen, housekeepers, kitchen staff, secretaries, stable hands. 47 people witnessing what was about to happen. Lucian had requested the audience deliberately. Power exercised in private was negotiation. Power exercised in public was precedent. "State your business," Lucian said. He didn't sit. He didn't offer a seat. He stood 10 feet from the envoy and let the architecture of the hall do its work. The 40-foot ceilings, the ancestral portraits, the obsidian floor reflecting the man's own nervous stance back at him from every angle. The envoy cleared his throat. "Your Grace, I am Frederick Selwyn, retained counsel for Lady Constance Devereux of the Ashford Devereux household. I carry a formal petition demanding the immediate release and return of Lady Seraphina Vale to her lawful guardian's custody." Lawful. Lucian repeated the word without inflection. Lady Devereux has maintained custodial responsibility for Lady Vale for 9 years under established... Under what authority? Selwyn paused. Under familial obligation, Your Grace. As the nearest maternal relative, the nearest maternal relative. Lucian took 2 steps forward. Not aggressive. Measured. The way a man closes distance when he wants the other person to feel the geometry of the room shrinking around them. Lady Devereux assumed custody of Seraphina Vale after the death of Lord Marcus Vale. Correct? That is correct. And during those 9 years, Lady Devereux never once contacted this household regarding the covenant binding the Vale and Blackthorne families. A covenant that supersedes familial custody claims. A covenant that was filed, sealed, and witnessed under the legal authority of 2 sovereign houses. Selwyn's fingers tightened on the folio. Lady Devereux was not aware of an... Don't! The word dropped into the hall like a stone into deep water. Lucian's voice hadn't risen. It had lowered, which was worse. Don't stand in my receiving hall and tell me that Lady Devereux, a woman connected to the Ashford Banking Consortium, a woman whose financial consultant previously served as this household's comptroller, a woman whose interests directly benefited from the Vale inheritance remaining unclaimed, was not aware of a legally binding covenant that someone in her network paid to have buried in my archives. Silence. The kind of silence that makes breathing audible. Selwyn's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Your Grace, these are serious accusations. They're not accusations. Accusations require proof. What I have are questions. Questions about pension authorizations to a retired archivist. Questions about financial transfers that routed Vale assets through holding companies connected to your client's banking interests. Questions about the systematic dismantling of a young woman's identity, inheritance, and legal standing while she was under the so-called protection of a guardian who apparently found her most useful when she was invisible. Lucian stopped. He was close enough now to see the sweat forming along Selwyn's hairline. The envoy was not a weak man. Retained counsel for the Devereux family required a certain baseline of nerve, but nerve had limits, and Frederick Selwyn had just discovered his. Your message to Lady Devereux, Lucian said, is this. Lady Seraphina Vale is under the protection of House Blackthorne. That protection is not a request. It is not a negotiation. It is an exercise of sovereign authority under a covenant that predates Lady Devereux's custodial claim by a decade. Any attempt to challenge that authority, legally, politically, or otherwise, will be met with a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding the suppression of the Vale Blackthorne covenant. And Mr. Selwyn, Lucian leaned forward, close enough that his next words were audible only to the envoy. You should advise your client that I have been investigating for less than 48 hours, and I have already found enough to end careers. Imagine what I'll find in a month. Selwyn's face had gone the color of old paper. Do you have a written response for Lady Devereux, Your Grace? I just gave you my response. If she needs it in writing, she can send someone braver than you to collect it. The envoy left. His expensive boots made rapid, uneven sounds on the obsidian floor, the rhythm of a man retreating while trying to preserve the illusion that he was merely departing. The household staff watched him go in absolute silence, and when the main doors closed behind him, 47 people stood in a hall that now contained something new. Not just authority, intent. The unmistakable signal that their duke had chosen a position, planted his flag in it, and would burn down anything that tried to dislodge him. Edmund materialized at Lucien's shoulder. That will reach every noble house in the Dominion within a week, Your Grace. Good. The Devereux family will interpret it as a declaration of hostilities. Also good. May I ask, is that the intended outcome? Lucien looked at his steward. 28 years of service. 3 generations of Blackthorns. Edmund Graves had earned the right to ask questions that would have gotten anyone else dismissed from the room. When a house discovers that its covenant has been sabotaged, its archives compromised, and its sworn obligation to a dead ally deliberately obstructed, Lucien said, the intended outcome is whatever restores the integrity of that house. If the Devereux family experiences that as hostility, it tells me everything I need to know about their involvement. Edmund nodded once. I'll prepare the diplomatic channels. Don't. Let them come to us. Every move they make from this point forward is information. The thing about a man like Lucien was that his possessiveness didn't announce itself with grand declarations or dramatic gestures. It operated below the surface, in the infrastructure, the way load-bearing walls hold a building upright without anyone noticing them until they're removed and everything collapses. He didn't think of Serafina as something to possess. He thought of her as something that belonged under his protection by the law of his father's word, and the distinction between those two things, possession and obligation, had been collapsing since the moment she stood in his rain-soaked courtyard and didn't flinch. He was aware of the collapse. He didn't examine it. Examining internal architecture while under operational pressure was a luxury he couldn't afford. Instead, he redirected the energy where it was useful, into the investigation, into the strategic dismantling of a conspiracy that had been building for almost 2 decades, into the relentless accumulation of evidence that would eventually become undeniable. He returned to the war room. Serafina had not stayed in her chair. She had reorganized the entire map table. The documents were now arranged in a timeline that stretched across the full surface, color-coded by source, cross-referenced by name, connected by thin pencil lines she had drawn directly on the table's surface. Most people would have hesitated to mark a duke's war table. Serafina had treated it like the tool it was. You drew on my table, Lucien said from the doorway. Your table needed drawing on. She didn't look up. The chronology was wrong. You had the pension authorization dated after the archival reclassification, but the financial records show the pension was dispersed in quarterly installments starting 6 months before the document was moved, which means the archivist was paid in advance, not rewarded after the fact. Lucien crossed to the table and studied her timeline. She was right. The sequencing change wasn't just a correction. It fundamentally altered the conspiracy's architecture. Advance payment meant advance planning. It meant the person who ordered the covenant buried had committed to the operation before the archivist even agreed to do it. They were confident, Lucien said. They were organized. There's a difference. Serafina finally looked up. Confident people make mistakes because they underestimate resistance. Organized people make mistakes because they overestimate their ability to control variables. This, she gestured at the timeline, is the work of someone who tried to control every variable, which means somewhere in this structure there's a variable they missed. Such as? Such as me being alive and capable of reading financial records. There it was. Not delivered as a joke, not softened with self-deprecation. A flat mechanical statement of fact from a woman who understood that her continued existence was the one outcome the conspirators had failed to properly account for. They had planned for her irrelevance. They had not planned for her competence. Lucien studied her across the table. The scar on her jawline, the calloused hands, the short hair that was starting to grow out just enough to fall across her forehead when she leaned over documents. She had spent the last 4 hours alone in a war room doing the analytical work of a trained intelligence officer, and she had done it better than most of the trained intelligence officers Lucien had employed over the years. "Where did you learn forensic accounting?" he asked. Lady Devereux kept a very disorganized household. Someone had to reconcile the books. She assumed I was doing servant's work. I was actually learning how money moves. That quiet, devastating competence. 9 years of captivity turned into 9 years of covert education. The woman who was supposed to be invisible had used her invisibility to become the most dangerous person in the room. Something shifted in Lucien's chest. A structural adjustment. He didn't name it. "The envoy has been dealt with," he said. "I heard it." She paused. "The acoustics in this fortress carry more than you probably intend." "What did you hear?" "Enough to know that Lady Devereux now understands you're not going to hand me back." Was there any doubt? Serafina met his eyes. "In my experience, people with power make promises until the cost of keeping them exceeds the cost of breaking them. You just raised the cost of keeping yours significantly. I raised the cost of challenging me. There's a difference." Is there? The question hung between them. It was the kind of question that operated on multiple frequencies, practical, philosophical, personal, and the answer to each frequency was different. Lucien recognized the complexity of it. He also recognized that she was testing him, probing his structural integrity the way an engineer tests a bridge before trusting it with weight. "Lady Devereux will escalate," Serafina said, breaking the silence. "She won't come herself. She'll use proxies. The Ashford banking interest will pressure your trade relationships. The noble families connected to the land acquisitions will file legal challenges. And if none of that works, she'll go to the Grand Council and petition for a sovereignty review." Lucien's eyebrows rose. "Not much, a fraction." "You understand aristocratic warfare." "I understand Lady Devereux. She doesn't fight battles. She creates situations where other people fight them for her. The money does the work. She just points it." "And what would you recommend?" The question surprised her. He could see it in the micro-expression that crossed her face, the brief widening of the eyes, the slight parting of the lips, the rapid recalculation of a woman who had expected to be protected but not consulted. "Control the narrative," she said. "Right now this looks like a duke exercising personal authority over a custodial dispute. That framing benefits Devereux. It makes you look possessive and her look victimized. You need to reframe it as a covenant enforcement, a legal obligation, a matter of house honor that transcends individual interests. And how do I do that? You make it public, not the investigation, that stays operational, but the covenant itself. File the enforcement through the Dominion's legal registry. Make it a matter of public record that House Blackthorn is honoring a sworn obligation to a dead ally. That shifts the narrative from personal to institutional, and anyone who opposes it isn't fighting you. They're fighting the legal foundation that holds every noble covenant in the Dominion together." Lucien was quiet for a long time. He stood across the table from her, and the war room held them both in its cold, strategic light. The Duke, and the woman he was beginning to realize was not the damaged heir he'd expected to find, but something entirely different. Something with edges. Something that had been sharpened by the same forces that were supposed to break it. "You should have been running an estate," he said. "I should have been running my father's estate. That was the plan." "The plan hasn't changed. It's been delayed." Their eyes held. The conversation had shifted into territory that neither of them was fully equipped to navigate. The space between strategy and something more personal, more dangerous, more structurally significant. Lucien could feel it the way he felt changes in atmospheric pressure before storms. Something was building, something that would eventually require acknowledgement. Not now. Now there was work. "Edmund," Lucien called. The steward appeared within seconds. "Your Grace. Draft a formal covenant enforcement filing for the Dominion Legal Registry. Include the original document, both signatures, and the activation clause triggered by Lord Vale's death. I want it submitted by end of business today." "Your Grace, the filing will be public record. Every noble family in the Dominion will see it. That's the point." Edmund looked at Serafina, then back at Lucien. Something in his expression shifted. The particular recalibration of a man who had served power his entire life, and was now watching it evolve in real time into something he hadn't anticipated. "At once, Your Grace." He left. The door closed. Serafina sat down. She placed her hands flat on the table, on top of the timeline she had built, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Blackthorn Keep, something cracked in the facade. Not much. A tremor in her fingers, a tightening around her eyes. The structural compression of a woman who had held herself together through 9 years of systematic erasure and was now sitting in a room where someone had not only listened to her analysis, but acted on it, immediately, without qualification. She didn't cry. Serafina Vale had decommissioned that response years ago, stripped it out of her operational architecture the way you remove a rusted component from a machine. But her hands trembled on the table, and Lucien saw it, and he did the only thing that his own architecture permitted. He sat down across from her. He pulled the next document from the stack. He started reading. He gave her the dignity of not being watched. 3 floors below, in a private chamber adjacent to the servants' quarters, a man in the uniform of a Blackthorn household clerk sat at a small desk. He pulled a sheet of paper from his drawer, dipped a pen in ink, and began writing a letter addressed not to Lady Constance Devereux, but to a name that appeared nowhere in any of the documents currently spread across the Duke's war table. A name that, when it eventually surfaced, would prove that the conspiracy threatening Serafina Vale was not the work of one ambitious woman and her banking connections. It was the work of someone inside Blackthorn Keep itself. The clerk finished the letter, sealed it with plain wax, no insignia, no housemark, and slipped it into the outgoing post alongside routine household correspondence where it would attract no attention. Then he returned to his duties, and the fortress continued its business around him, and the most dangerous secret in Ravenshire walked calmly through the halls of the house that was supposed to protect it. The letter reached its destination in 4 days. The response came back in 2, not as a letter, but as an event. Lucien was in the East Corridor reviewing Captain Voss's security report when the first anomaly registered. A trade delegation from the Ashford Banking Consortium had arrived at the Dominion's central port requesting emergency commercial arbitration. Standard procedure required a 3-week filing period. They had been granted same-day access by a magistrate named Orrin Whitfield, a man Lucien had appointed to the commercial bench 6 years ago on the recommendation of his household counsel. The second anomaly arrived an hour later. 3 noble families, Harwick, Pemberton, and Stahl, simultaneously withdrew their support for a Blackthorn-sponsored infrastructure levy that had been moving through the Dominion legislature for months. No explanation, no diplomatic courtesy, just coordinated withdrawal, executed with the kind of synchronization that doesn't happen by accident. The third anomaly was the one that stopped him in the corridor. Edmund appeared with a sealed envelope. His face was the color of wet stone. Your Grace, the Grand Council has accepted a formal petition for sovereign review of the Vale Blackthorn Covenant. The petition was filed this morning by a coalition of 11 noble houses. Lucien took the envelope. Read the filing notice. Read the list of petitioning families. Read the name of the lead petitioner. Lord Aldrich Mercer. His hands didn't shake. His expression didn't change. But something behind his eyes went very still. The particular stillness of a system under catastrophic load, processing damage before deciding whether to hold or fail. Lord Aldrich Mercer, senior member of the Blackthorn Household Council, trusted advisor to Lucien's father before him, the man who had sat across from Lucien at the council table for 12 years, offering strategic counsel, managing diplomatic relationships, and serving as the public face of Blackthorn political interests in the Grand Council chambers. The man Lucien had trusted more than anyone outside his immediate staff. Edmund. His voice was level, controlled, the voice of a man holding a blade steady while the ground trembles beneath him. When was the last time Lord Mercer accessed the household archives? Edmund's hesitation told Lucien everything. 3 weeks ago, Your Grace. 2 days before the covenant was brought to your attention. The corridor went silent. Lucien stood with the filing notice in his hand and felt something he had not felt in years, a structural compromise in the architecture of his own certainty. Not doubt. Doubt was intellectual. This was physical. It lived in his chest like a fracture line in a support column, invisible from the outside but changing the load distribution of everything above it. Mercer had accessed the archives 3 weeks ago. 2 days later, the covenant surfaced on his desk. At the time, Lucien had attributed the discovery to Edmund's routine document review. But Edmund hadn't found the covenant. Someone had wanted it found. Someone had calculated that Lucien would react exactly the way he did, by bringing Serafina to Ravenshire, by confronting the Devereux family, by filing the covenant publicly and committing his authority to its enforcement. Someone had used the covenant as bait, and Lucien had taken it. He walked to the war room. His stride was the same length it always was. His posture didn't change. The servants he passed saw nothing different about their duke. But inside the architecture, load-bearing walls were shifting, and the man who had built his entire operational identity on the principle that he could see every angle, calculate every variable, and anticipate every threat was now standing inside a structure that someone else had designed around him. Serafina was at the map table. She looked up when he entered, and her body went rigid, not from his expression, which was controlled, but from something subtler, the way he moved. The micro-adjustment in his gait that told her the man walking toward her was carrying damage he hadn't yet processed. "What happened?" she said. He placed the filing notice on the table. She read it. When she reached Mercer's name, her eyes lifted to his. "You know him." "He's on my council." "How long?" 12 years. Serafina set the document down. "Tell me about him." Lucien didn't sit. He stood at the table and felt the fracture line in his chest widen by a millimeter. Aldrich Mercer, 61 years old, held the Mercer seat in the Grand Council for 30 years before transitioning to an advisory role in this household. He managed my father's diplomatic portfolio during the Western Territory negotiations. He was the first person my father consulted on matters of inter-house relations. When my father died, Mercer stayed. He said the Blackthorn legacy was worth more than retirement. And you believed him. I had no reason not to. His record was impeccable. His counsel was consistently sound. His loyalty was demonstrated, repeatedly. Demonstrated how? Lucien was quiet. The question cut closer than he wanted to admit. How had Mercer demonstrated loyalty? By being present, by being reliable, by saying the right things at the right moments, and never giving Lucien a reason to look deeper. And that, Lucien realized with a clarity that felt like a blade sliding between his ribs, was exactly the problem. Real loyalty endures scrutiny. Performed loyalty avoids it. Mercer had never been scrutinized because he had never given a reason to be, and a man who never gives a reason is either perfectly trustworthy or perfectly camouflaged. He positioned himself, Lucien said slowly, where suspicion would never reach. For 12 years. For 12 years. Serafina watched him. She was reading his internal architecture the way she read financial documents, looking for the structural stress, the hidden liabilities, the places where the numbers didn't add up. The covenant surfacing wasn't accidental, she said. He wanted you to find it. Yes. Why? Lucien placed both hands on the table. His knuckles were white. Because finding it would force me to act, and acting would expose my position before I had the full picture. He needed me committed, publicly, legally, irrevocably committed, before the counter-operation launched. The petition, the trade withdrawal, the banking arbitration, all of it coordinated, all of it timed to hit simultaneously after I had staked my authority on the covenant enforcement. He didn't just betray me. He engineered the conditions that would make the betrayal maximally destructive. The words landed in the room like debris. Lucien heard himself say them and understood in the particular way that a man understands structural failure while standing inside the structure, that the conspiracy he had been mapping for the past 2 weeks was not the real conspiracy. The Devereux connection, the pension payoffs, the archived suppression, all of it was real, but it was the outer layer. The visible infrastructure designed to be found, to be investigated, to consume his attention while the actual operation, Mercer's operation, moved beneath it. He had been outmaneuvered. The realization sat in his chest like a cold stone. Captain Voss arrived 17 minutes later. The soldier entered the war room and stopped when he saw Lucien's face. In 20 years of service, Voss had seen the Duke angry, strategic, ruthless, and occasionally amused. He had never seen this expression, the controlled devastation of a man whose foundational assumptions had just been demolished. Mercer, Lucien said, I need everything. Every communication, every meeting, every financial transaction for the last 5 years. And I need the clerk who handles outgoing posts brought to this room. Now. The clerk, Your Grace? Someone in this household has been communicating with external parties. The letter would have gone through outgoing post within the last 2 weeks. Find the clerk who processed it. Voss moved fast. Within the hour, a trembling man named Jasper Holt was standing in the war room. Holt was 30, unremarkable, the kind of administrative functionary who survives in large households by being competent and invisible. He had been invisible for 3 years. He was not invisible now. Lucien didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The war room itself did the work. The strategic maps, the spread documents, the 2 people staring at Holt from across a table that was covered in evidence of a conspiracy he had helped facilitate. Mr. Holt, you sent a letter 2 weeks ago. Unsealed house correspondence, plain wax, no insignia. Who was it addressed to? Holt's breathing was shallow and rapid. His eyes moved from Lucien to Serafina to Voss and back. Your Grace, I don't. Lucien's voice cut like a surgical instrument. You have one opportunity to answer me truthfully. The alternative is that I turn the investigation over to Captain Voss, who will reconstruct every piece of correspondence you've handled for the past 3 years using the postal records this household meticulously maintains. The outcome is the same. The difference is time, and whether you spend that time as a cooperating witness or a detained suspect. Holt's resolve lasted 4 seconds. Lucien counted them. Lord Mercer. The name came out like something being extracted. The letter went to Lord Mercer's city residence. I was paid to forward information about the Duke's investigation, the archive access, the documents being reviewed, the timeline. How long? 3 months, Your Grace, since before the covenant was brought to your attention. 3 months. Lucien absorbed the number. 3 months of compromised operational security. 3 months during which Mercer had known every document Lucien accessed, every connection he explored, every strategic decision he made. The investigation hadn't been a pursuit. It had been a performance, and the audience had been the very man orchestrating the conspiracy. Who recruited you? Lord Mercer approached me directly. He said, Holt's voice cracked. He said it was a loyalty test, that you had authorized surveillance of your own staff, and he was managing the operation on your behalf. The audacity of it stopped Lucien's breath for half a second. Using his name, Mercer had used Lucien's own authority as the cover story, weaponizing the Duke's reputation for surveillance and control to recruit an asset inside his own household. Voss, Lucien said, detain Mr. Holt. Separate quarters. No contact with any household staff. Voss led the clerk out. The door closed. Lucien stood at the table in silence. His hands were still flat on the surface, and he could feel the wood grain against his palms. Smooth, solid, real. A physical anchor in a moment when the abstract structures of trust and strategy and 12 years of believed loyalty were collapsing around him like poorly engineered walls. Serafina didn't speak. She stood across from him and gave him what he had given her on the first day, the dignity of not being watched in a moment of internal demolition. She turned to the timeline on the table and began quietly rearranging documents, incorporating the new information, rebuilding the conspiracy map with Mercer at its center instead of Devereaux. 5 minutes passed. 10. It wasn't just my father's covenant, Serafina said finally. Her voice was low, operational, directed at the documents rather than at him. Mercer wasn't protecting Devereaux's custody claim. He was protecting a larger asset structure. Look at this. She slid 3 documents together. The Vale lands that were transferred through holding companies. The ultimate beneficiary isn't the Ashford Consortium. It's a trust registered under a name I don't recognize, Sovereign Holdings Limited. Lucien looked at the documents. His eyes were different now, not the cold, calculating gray that had served him for 34 years. Something had been stripped away, a layer of insulation between himself and the raw machinery of his own intelligence. What was left was sharper, more dangerous, and completely unprotected. Sovereign Holdings, he repeated. Pull the registry. They worked for another hour. The registry trace led to incorporation documents filed in a jurisdiction outside the Dominion. Deliberate, designed to complicate domestic investigation. But Serafina found the thread. a signatory on the incorporation filing whose handwriting matched correspondence in the Blackthorn Diplomatic Archive. Correspondence signed by Lord Aldrich Mercer. The conspiracy was not about custody. It was not about a single woman's inheritance. It was about land. Thousands of acres of Vale territory that represented the most strategically valuable agricultural corridor in the Eastern Dominion. Territory that, if controlled through anonymous holding structures, would give whoever owned it effective veto power over the Dominion's food supply chain. Mercer hadn't spent 12 years on Lucian's council out of loyalty. He had spent 12 years positioning himself to steal an empire from the inside. Lucian sat down. He sat in the chair at the head of the war table and felt the full weight of 12 years of manufactured trust pressing on his chest like stone. Every conversation, every piece of counsel, every moment when Mercer had stood beside him and performed the role of trusted advisor while systematically constructing the architecture of betrayal beneath him. A man builds himself into a fortress. He walls off vulnerability, reinforces certainty, eliminates the blind spots where sentiment could compromise strategic function. And then he discovers that the greatest threat was never external. It was the person he allowed inside the walls, the one exception to his own security protocols, the calculated trust that turned out to be the most catastrophic miscalculation of his life. "The Grand Sovereign Ball," Serafina said. Lucian looked up. "It's in 3 weeks. Every noble family in the Dominion attends. Mercer will be there. The petitioning houses will be there. If the Sovereign Review gains momentum before the ball, the coalition will use it as a public platform to delegitimize your authority and finalize the land transfers while the legal framework is in dispute. You want to confront him at the ball. I want to destroy him at the ball. There's a difference." She sat down across from Lucien and leaned forward. "We have 3 weeks to build a case that can't be denied, dismissed, or buried. Financial records, archival evidence, the clerk's testimony, the incorporation documents. All of it assembled into a single, undeniable indictment presented in front of every family that signed that petition. And if Mercer anticipates it? He anticipates the Duke who trusted him, the man who operated on calculation and maintained a controlled distance from everyone around him. That Duke is predictable. Mercer has been predicting him for 12 years. Serafina paused. "Don't be that Duke." The words hit something structural. Not the walls, but the foundation. The bedrock assumption that Lucien had built his entire identity upon. That control was strength, that distance was safety. That the architecture of power required isolation as its primary building material. Mercer had used that architecture against him. Every wall Lucien built to keep threats out had also kept him blind to the threat that was already inside. The distance that protected him from vulnerability had also protected Mercer from scrutiny. The control that made Lucien effective had made him predictable. The fortress had become the trap. And the woman sitting across from him, the woman who had been erased, dismantled, reduced to nothing by the same conspiracy that had infiltrated his household, was telling him that the only way to win was to become something he had spent his entire adult life refusing to be. Unpredictable, exposed, willing to operate without the architecture that had defined him. Lucian Blackthorn looked at Serafina Vale across a table covered in the wreckage of his oldest alliance, and he understood, not intellectually, but structurally, in the load-bearing center of who he was, that the man who had walked into this room could not win the war that was coming. That man had already lost. Whoever walked out of this room would have to be someone different. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she confirmed. He stood. He looked at the timeline, at the evidence, at the map of a conspiracy that had been growing inside his own house like a cancer he had been too controlled, too disciplined, too certain of his own invulnerability to detect. Then he looked at her. "We do this together," he said, "not as a duke protecting an obligation, not as a strategic calculation, together, whatever that requires." Serafina held his gaze, the last wall between them, the one built from mutual caution and operational distance, and the shared instinct of two people who had learned to survive by trusting nothing, didn't collapse. It was dismantled, deliberately, brick by brick, in full view of both of them. "Together," she said. And in the war room of Blackthorn Keep, above archives full of buried secrets and below ceilings that had witnessed 3 generations of calculated power, two people who had been built into fortresses agreed to tear their own walls down, because the enemy was already inside, and the only weapon left was becoming something he couldn't predict. 3 weeks is not a long time. It is an eternity when every hour carries the weight of a decision that cannot be reversed, and it is nothing at all when measured against the scope of what must be accomplished within it. Lucian Blackthorne spent those 21 days becoming someone Aldrich Mercer had never mapped. He stopped attending council meetings. He canceled diplomatic receptions. He withdrew from every public-facing function on his calendar and let the silence speak. Let the noble houses interpret his absence however they wanted. Some said the Duke was retreating. Some said he was calculating. Some said the sovereign review petition had shaken him. Mercer, Lucian was certain, said all three to different audiences and believed the first. That was the point. A man who has been predictable for 12 years doesn't change overnight without creating noise, and noise creates confusion, and confusion is the only environment where a compromised position can be rebuilt without the enemy seeing the new architecture take shape. In private, Lucien and Serafina worked with a precision that bordered on obsessive. Voss ran field agents through the Devereaux financial network. Edmond, once Lucien confirmed his steward's loyalty through a forensic review of 30 years of service records, managed diplomatic intelligence. And Serafina, with the analytical ferocity of someone rebuilding the story of her own destruction, traced every financial thread from the Vale estate through the holding companies to Sovereign Holdings, and back to Mercer's personal accounts. The case assembled itself like a building going up in fast forward. Foundation, framing, walls, roof. By the end of the second week, they had documented proof of the pension payments to the retired archivist, the clerk's testimony linking Mercer to the intelligence leak, incorporation records with Mercer's handwriting, and a complete financial chain showing Vale assets funneled through 5 shell entities into a trust Mercer controlled. By the end of the third week, they had something else. Something Serafina found at 2 a.m. in a stack of diplomatic correspondence that had been stored in a separate archive. Lord Marcus Vale's personal letters to Lucian's father. Letters that had never been catalogued because they arrived through private courier, not official channels. Letters that described in Marcus Vale's careful handwriting his growing suspicion that someone in the aristocratic network was systematically acquiring agricultural land through fraudulent estate transfers. Letters that named Aldrich Mercer as a person of concern. Marcus Vale had known. He had written to the one man he trusted to investigate. And those letters had arrived at Blackthorne Keep, where they were received by the household's diplomatic coordinator, a role held at that time by Aldrich Mercer. The letters had never reached Lucian's father. Serafina held the final letter in her hands. Her fingers didn't shake. She had burned through that response weeks ago. What was left was harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The absolute certainty of a woman holding proof that the man who orchestrated her father's ruin had been sitting inside the house that was supposed to protect her. He intercepted them, she said. My father was asking for help, and Mercer made sure it never came. Lucien stood behind her. He read the letter over her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, the controlled rhythm of his breathing. He placed one hand on the table beside hers, not touching, adjacent. A physical statement of proximity that carried more weight than any spoken promise. It came, he said, late, but it came. The Grand Sovereign Ball occupied the entirety of the Dominion's central palace, a sprawling complex of ballrooms, galleries, and reception halls that the founding families had built specifically for occasions when the aristocracy needed to perform unity while practicing war. Crystal chandeliers the size of carriages hung from ceilings painted with scenes of historical triumph. The floor was white marble veined with gold. Every surface reflected light and status and the carefully maintained illusion that the people standing on it were civilized. Lucien arrived with Serafina at his side. Not behind him, not following. Beside him, in a gown of deep midnight blue that the household seamstress had constructed over the past 2 weeks, with the focused intensity of someone who understood that clothing, in this context, was armor. Serafina's short hair was swept back from her face, exposing the scar on her jawline, a deliberate choice. She had refused the stylist's suggestion to conceal it. The scar was a record. She would not erase records. Not anymore. The entrance caused the exact disruption Lucien intended. 300 aristocrats turning simultaneously, conversation dying in concentric circles outward from the main doors. The Duke of Ravenshire, who had been publicly silent for 3 weeks, walking into the most important social event of the season with the woman whose legitimacy half the room had signed a petition to destroy. Not hiding her, presenting her, at his side, under his name. Lucian felt the room recalibrate. He felt the power dynamics shift like tectonic plates, subtle and massive, as every noble family in attendance recalculated their position based on the visual information now in front of them. The Duke hadn't retreated. He hadn't been shaken. He had been preparing, and whatever he had prepared was about to be deployed in front of every person who mattered. He scanned the room, found Mercer immediately. The old lord was standing near the eastern gallery with a glass of wine, surrounded by 3 members of the petitioning coalition. His expression when he saw Lucian was masterful, the composed surprise of a man who had anticipated several possible scenarios and was now selecting the appropriate response for the one that had materialized. Their eyes met across the ballroom, 60 feet of marble and crystal and 300 bodies between them, and the connection was immediate, electric, stripped of every pretense that had sustained it for 12 years. Mercer knew. In that instant, looking at Lucien's face, at Seraphina's presence, at the way they moved together with the coordinated precision of 2 people who had built something in those 3 silent weeks, Mercer knew the game had changed. The first hour was choreography. Lucien moved through the crowd with Seraphina, exchanging the minimum required diplomatic courtesies, letting the visual impact of their presence saturate the room. Spoke to allies, but the few who had declined to sign the petition. He acknowledged rivals with the exact degree of formality that communicated awareness without aggression. He let the tension build the way a conductor lets silence build before the downbeat. At 9 o'clock, the Dominion's Chancellor called for formal proceedings. Standard protocol, acknowledgement of attending houses, recognition of diplomatic guests, presentation of pending legislative matters. And then, as required by procedural rules, the reading of the Sovereign Review petition. The Chancellor, a cautious bureaucrat named Sterling, adjusted his spectacles and began reading the petition's summary. 11 houses requesting review of the Vale Blackthorn Covenant on grounds of procedural deficiency and contested authority. Lucien waited until Sterling finished. Then he stood. "The chair recognizes Duke Blackthorn," Sterling said, visibly uncomfortable. "Chancellor, before this body considers the petition, I invoke the right of direct response under Article 7 of the Sovereign Proceedings Code. A challenged party may present counter-evidence before any review is formalized." Sterling looked at Mercer. Mercer's face was neutral. "The right is procedurally valid," Sterling said. "The Duke may proceed." Lucien stepped into the center of the ballroom floor. The chandeliers above him cast light from every angle, eliminating shadows. There was nowhere to hide on that floor. That was the point. 3 weeks ago, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, with the particular authority of a man who has never needed to shout. 11 houses filed a petition challenging this household's enforcement of a sworn covenant, a covenant signed by my father and Lord Marcus Vale, a covenant that placed the protection of the Vale heir under Blackthorn authority. He paused. Let the silence work. I could respond to this petition with legal arguments. I could cite precedent, challenge jurisdiction, and let the matter dissolve into procedural debates that would take months to resolve. That is what the architects of this petition expect. That is what they have prepared for. Another pause. He could feel Mercer's attention like a physical force, the focused concentration of a man who is watching his own carefully designed structure being approached by someone holding a match. Instead, I'm going to tell you a story. He reached into his coat and produced the first document. He held it up, not for the room to read, but for the room to see. A physical artifact, real, undeniable. This is a pension authorization from the Blackthorn household. 16 years ago, a man named Cornelius Thatch, our head archivist, was paid a sum 3 times his annual salary to reclassify a single document, the Vale Blackthorn Covenant. He moved it from active obligations to a dormant classification where it would never surface through normal review. He was paid in advance, quarterly installments, authorized not by my father, but by a household comptroller who subsequently left our service and entered the employment of the Devereux family. Murmurs. He didn't wait for them to die. This, he produced the second document, is an incorporation filing for an entity called Sovereign Holdings Limited, a trust that acquired, through a series of fraudulent estate transfers, approximately 12,000 acres of Vale territory, agricultural land, the most productive farming corridor in the Eastern Dominion. The murmurs became louder. He let them rise, let the room feel the weight of what was coming. The incorporation filing bears a signature. I have had that signature verified by 3 independent forensic analysts. He lowered the document and looked directly at Aldrich Mercer. It belongs to Lord Aldrich Mercer. The ballroom detonated. Not with sound, with silence. The particular silence of 300 people simultaneously holding their breath, their bodies rigid, their eyes moving between the Duke and the man he had just named. Mercer didn't flinch. The old lord set his wine glass on a passing servant's tray with steady hands and met Lucian's gaze with an expression that, under different circumstances, might have passed for dignity. "These are extraordinary accusations, Your Grace." "They're not accusations. They're evidence. Shall I continue?" "By all means." The words were calm. The subtext was lethal. 2 men who had sat across the same table for 12 years, who had shared strategy and counsel and the particular intimacy of trusted alliance, now facing each other across a marble floor while 300 witnesses held their breath. Lucien continued. He produced the correspondence log showing Mercer's archive access, the clerk's sworn testimony, the financial chain connecting Mercer to every shell entity involved in the Vale asset transfers, and then the killing blow, Marcus Vale's intercepted letters. "Lord Vale wrote to my father." Lucian's voice had dropped. Not for effect, because what he was saying carried a weight that volume would have cheapened. He wrote describing his suspicion that his estate was being targeted. He named Lord Mercer as a person of concern. Those letters were sent through private courier to Blackthorn Keep, where they were received by the household's diplomatic coordinator, a role held at that time by the same Lord Mercer. He held up the letters. Marcus Vale's careful handwriting visible even from across the room. "These letters never reached my father. Lord Vale died believing his ally had abandoned him. His daughter spent 9 years in the custody of a woman who was complicit in the theft of her inheritance. And the man who orchestrated all of it, the suppression of the covenant, the theft of the estate, the erasure of an entire bloodline, sat on my council for 12 years and called it loyalty." Mercer stepped forward. His composure was fracturing now, micro-expressions breaking through the diplomatic mask like fault lines appearing in polished stone. But his voice held. "Your Grace is painting a compelling narrative, but narratives are not evidence. Documents can be forged, testimony can be purchased, and a duke who has publicly staked his reputation on a personal attachment to a contested heir has every motivation to manufacture a conspiracy that justifies his position." The counterattack was elegant. Lucien had expected it. Question the evidence, question the motive. Reframe the Duke's presentation as a desperate performance rather than an investigation. But Lucian Blackthorn had not spent 3 weeks preparing a presentation. He had spent 3 weeks preparing for this exact moment. The moment when Mercer would try to shift the frame, redirect the narrative, and turn the accusation back on the accuser. "You're right," Lucian said. "Documents can be forged, so let's establish authenticity." He turned to the room. "Chancellor Sterling, I formally request that the Grand Council impound the archives of Sovereign Holdings Limited and submit the incorporation documents to independent forensic analysis. I further request that the financial records of the Devereux household be subpoenaed for cross-reference with the transaction chains I have presented tonight. And I request that Lord Mercer's personal accounts be frozen pending investigation." The room erupted. Not murmurs this time, full-throated chaos. Noble families turning to each other, petitioning houses breaking formation. The coalition Mercer had built over years of patient manipulation fracturing in real time as its members recalculated the cost of association with a man who was now, publicly and undeniably, accused of fraud, conspiracy, and the systematic destruction of a noble house. Mercer's mask shattered. "You have no authority to—" "I have every authority." Lucien's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Article 12 of the Sovereign Code. A sitting duke may petition for emergency financial investigation when evidence suggests fraud involving Dominion territory. The evidence is in your handwriting, Mercer. Your handwriting on incorporation documents. Your name on financial transfers. your access logs in my archives, and your voice, through a sworn witness, directing intelligence operations inside my household. He stepped closer. Close enough that the next words were for Mercer alone, though the room was quiet enough to hear them. You spent 12 years inside my walls. You ate at my table. You counseled my decisions. And every single day, you were stealing from a dead man's daughter and betting that I would never look closely enough to see it. Mercer's breathing had changed. The controlled rhythm of a practiced diplomat had given way to something raw, the shallow, rapid breath of a man whose exit routes were closing simultaneously. Lucien. First name. The intimacy of it was a weapon. An attempt to invoke the personal relationship, to remind the room and the Duke that this was not just politics. You are making a mistake that will cost you everything. You already cost me everything that mattered. My father's word, my house's honor, 12 years of trust I will never get back. Lucien's voice was steady. What happens next doesn't cost me anything. It costs you. He turned to Chancellor Sterling. I call for an immediate vote on the emergency investigation. Every house present, on the record. Sterling looked at the room, at the fractured coalition, at the noble families who had signed Mercer's petition and were now staring at the evidence spread across the Duke's hands like a bomb that had already detonated. The vote will proceed, Sterling said. Mercer turned to his allies. The three lords who had been standing with him at the Eastern Gallery were gone, melted into the crowd, distancing themselves with the practiced efficiency of politicians who recognize a sinking vessel. And then Serafina stepped forward. She walked to the center of the ballroom floor and stood beside Lucien. Not behind him, beside him. The scar on her jawline caught the chandelier light. Her hands were steady. Her eyes found Mercer's and held them with the absolute stillness of a woman who had spent 9 years in a cage built by the man standing in front of her. Lord Mercer, she said. Her voice was clear, calm. The kind of calm that comes after fury has burned through every volatile element and left only the structural core behind. My father trusted your judgment, your integrity, your word. He wrote letters asking for help, and you made sure those letters disappeared. You watched me become nothing, and you did it from inside the house that was supposed to make sure that never happened. She took one step closer. I am not nothing. The ballroom held its breath. And Aldrich Mercer, 61 years old, 30 years in politics, 12 years of perfectly executed betrayal, looked at the woman he had erased and the Duke he had deceived, standing together on a marble floor surrounded by 300 witnesses and the complete documented architecture of his own conspiracy, and understood with absolute finality that there was no speech, no maneuver, no alliance left that could save him. His hand moved to his coat, not reaching for a weapon, reaching for the inner pocket where Lucien knew, because he knew this man, had known him for 12 years, had studied his habits with the obsessive attention of someone who once believed that knowledge was the same as trust. Mercer kept his personal correspondence. Mercer pulled out a single folded letter. He held it up. If this proceeds, Mercer said, and his voice had changed, stripped of diplomacy, stripped of performance, raw and cold and final, then what is in this letter reaches every newspaper in the Dominion by morning, and the damage, Your Grace, will not be limited to me. The room went still. Lucien looked at the letter, at Mercer's face, at the expression of a man who had lost the war but was holding the trigger to a final explosion designed to ensure that winning felt indistinguishable from losing. The chandelier light caught the edge of the paper, and Lucien Blackthorne stood on the marble floor of the Grand Sovereign Ball, 300 witnesses watching, the woman he had chosen standing beside him, the evidence of 12 years of betrayal in his hands, and faced the one variable he had not anticipated, the weapon Mercer had saved for last. Lucien looked at the letter in Mercer's hand. He looked at it the way a man looks at a loaded weapon pointed at his chest, not with fear, but with the cold operational clarity of someone calculating distance, trajectory, and the cost of every possible response. 300 people waited. The chandeliers hummed above them. Somewhere in the room, a glass touched a table too hard, and the sound cracked through the silence like a bone breaking. Read it, Lucien said. Mercer's composure fractured, just slightly, just enough for Lucien to see the recalculation behind the old lord's eyes. The weapon was designed to be threatened, not deployed. It was a negotiating instrument, A final leverage point meant to force a private settlement, a quiet withdrawal, a return to the architecture of concealment that had protected Mercer for decades. Lucien had just removed that option. "Read it," he said again, "in front of every house present. Whatever you have, whatever you think you're holding, let the room hear it, because I am done with secrets that rot inside walls, every one of them, including mine." The marble floor held both of them. The chandelier light was merciless. And Mercer, who had spent 30 years in political combat, who had engineered the theft of an estate and the erasure of a bloodline, and the infiltration of the most powerful household in the Dominion, understood in that moment that his final weapon had been neutralized not by counter-strategy, but by something he had never anticipated: willingness. The willingness of a man to stand in public and accept damage rather than retreat into the safety of private negotiation. Mercer's entire operational framework depended on the assumption that powerful men protect their reputations above all else. That assumption had defined every alliance he built, every conspiracy he designed, every leverage point he accumulated over 3 decades. Lucien Blackthorne had just demolished it. Mercer unfolded the letter. His hands were steady. The last mechanical function of a man whose strategic infrastructure was collapsing beneath him. "This letter," Mercer said, and his voice carried the brittle clarity of something about to shatter, "contains a detailed account of the financial irregularities in the Blackthorne estate during the transition from the previous duke, irregularities that suggest Lucien Blackthorne's inheritance itself was secured through selective interpretation of succession protocols." The room shifted. Murmurs. Lucien felt the accusation land against his chest like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it was designed to be plausible. His father's death, the rapid succession, the consolidation of authority that Lucien had executed in the weeks following his ascension, all of it legitimate, all of it viewed through a deliberately distorted lens capable of appearing otherwise. Mercer had not just prepared an accusation, he had prepared a mirror, a version of Lucien's own story that reflected back as something darker, something compromised, something that would require months of investigation to disprove, even if the investigation ultimately vindicated him. This was the cost, not the truth. The time, the uncertainty, the erosion. Serafina moved, not much. A half step closer to Lucien, her shoulder aligned with his, the physical geometry of 2 people presenting a unified front. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The movement itself was a statement. Whatever comes next, it arrives for both of us. Lucien breathed. In. Out. He felt his heartbeat in his temples, in his wrists, in the base of his throat. He felt the sweat cooling along his spine beneath the formal coat. He felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes and the accumulated pressure of every decision that had brought him to this marble floor, standing across from a man who was trying to burn the house down because he couldn't steal it anymore. A man becomes most dangerous when he has nothing left to protect except the truth. Lucien had spent his entire life protecting other things: reputation, authority, strategic advantage, the carefully maintained architecture of invulnerability that allowed him to govern without exposure. All of it was currency. All of it could be spent. And standing on that ballroom floor, he realized with a clarity that felt like the first clean breath after years of breathing through stone, that the only thing worth keeping was the one thing Mercer couldn't take: the fact that every piece of evidence on that table was real. "Chancellor Sterling," Lucien said. His voice was even, controlled, not the control of a man hiding damage, the control of a man who has decided that steadiness matters to more than performance. "I welcome Lord Mercer's allegations. I welcome a full investigation into my succession, my estate, and every financial transaction this household has executed in my tenure." The room went silent again. Not the shocked silence of the earlier revelations. Something different. The attentive silence of people watching a man do something they hadn't expected. Open every door, unlock every archive, submit every private record to public scrutiny. Not because he was confident the investigation would vindicate him, because he was willing to accept whatever the investigation found. "Furthermore," Lucien continued, "I request that Lord Mercer's allegations be entered into the same investigative framework as the evidence I have presented tonight. Let the forensic analysts examine everything: his documents and mine, his financial records and mine, his handwriting and mine. All of it. Under the same scrutiny, at the same time, with the same transparency. He turned to Mercer. You built your power in shadows, Mercer. I'm offering you daylight. Take it or don't. But the investigation proceeds either way. The silence lasted 7 seconds. Lucien counted them the way he had counted the seconds of the clerk's resistance in the war room, measuring the interval between confrontation and collapse. Mercer's hands lowered. The letter dropped to his side. And the expression on his face, the final, unmasked expression of a man who has exhausted every weapon in his arsenal and discovered that the last one was a blank, told Lucien everything. It was over. Not with a dramatic confession, not with a grand collapse. The real endings, the ones that matter, the ones that reshape the architecture of a world, happen in the small moments. The lowering of a piece of paper. The shift in a man's posture from offensive to defeated. The almost imperceptible relaxation of 300 bodies as the tension breaks like a fever. Chancellor Sterling called the vote. The emergency investigation was approved unanimously. Even the houses that had signed Mercer's petition voted in favor. The political calculus had shifted so completely that opposition was no longer a strategic option. It was suicide. Mercer was escorted from the ballroom by Dominion marshals. He didn't resist. He walked between them with the rigid posture of a man maintaining the last structural element of his dignity, his bearing, because everything else had been stripped away in public, on the record, in front of every person who had ever believed his performance of loyalty. As he passed Lucien, he stopped. You'll never know, Mercer said quietly, whether the 12 years were entirely fabricated. Some of the counsel was real, Lucien. Some of it was genuine, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering which parts. Lucien looked at him, at the man who had eaten at his table, shaped his strategies, stood at his shoulder during moments that had felt, at the time, like partnership. The temptation to believe that some fraction of it had been real was enormous. It pulled at something deep in his chest, something that wanted the 12 years to mean something because the alternative, that every shared moment had been a performance, every piece of advice a manipulation, every gesture of loyalty a calculated investment in betrayal, was a loss too vast to fully comprehend. But Lucien had stopped lying to himself 3 weeks ago, in a war room, across a table from a woman who had taught him that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves about the people we trust. It doesn't matter, Lucien said, what was real and what was performance. The distinction only matters if I need the relationship to have meant something. I don't. What I need is for my father's word to be honored and for the damage you did to be repaired. The rest is your problem. Carry it yourself. Mercer left. The doors closed behind him. And the Grand Sovereign Ball, 300 aristocrats, 11 petitioning houses, a chancellor with sweat stains on his formal collar, and enough political wreckage to fuel a decade of diplomatic reconstruction, exhaled. The aftermath unfolded over weeks. Forensic analysts confirmed every piece of evidence Lucien had presented. Mercer's personal accounts were frozen, then seized. Sovereign Holdings Limited was dissolved by court order, and 12,000 acres of Vale territory were restored to their rightful owner. The holding companies that had facilitated the transfers were dismantled. Lady Constance Devereux, facing documentary evidence of her complicity, surrendered her custodial claims without legal contest and retreated to a provincial estate where the Ashford banking fortune could no longer shield her from the permanent diminishment of her social standing. The pension-bribed archivist returned the money. The compromised comptroller cooperated with investigators. The clerk, Jasper Holt, provided full testimony in exchange for leniency and disappeared into administrative obscurity, a small man who had been used by a larger mechanism and wanted nothing more than to be forgotten. Lucien's own succession was investigated with the same thoroughness he had demanded. The findings were unambiguous. Every protocol had been followed. Every financial transaction was legitimate. Every aspect of his inheritance was procedurally sound. Mercer's final weapon had been what Lucien suspected, a distortion, not a revelation. A funhouse mirror designed to make straight lines look crooked. The investigation concluded. The report was published. The record was clean. But records, Lucien, are documents. They describe what happened. They don't describe what it cost. He stood in the war room on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the ball, looking at the map table where Serafina had drawn her timeline in pencil. The marks were still there. thin graphite lines connecting documents that had since been filed, cataloged, and entered into the Dominion's legal archive. The conspiracy had been reduced to paperwork. The human wreckage it left behind could not be similarly organized. 12 years. He kept returning to the number. Not with anger. The operational fury had burned through its fuel weeks ago. What remained was something quieter, more structural. The recognition that his entire model of human engagement, the distance, the calculation, the systematic avoidance of vulnerability, had not protected him. It had blinded him. He had built walls to keep threats out and had succeeded only in creating an enclosed space where the most dangerous threat could operate undetected. The man who survives destruction is not the man who endures it. He is the man who allows it to change what needs changing without destroying what deserves to survive. Lucien stood in his war room and took inventory, not of strategic assets or political positions, but of himself. The discipline remained. The intelligence remained. The capacity for ruthless precision when the situation demanded it remained. But the isolation, the carefully maintained distance between himself and every person who entered his life, that had to go. Not because isolation was wrong, because it was incomplete. A fortress with no gate is not a stronghold, it is a prison. He heard her footsteps before she reached the door. He had learned her rhythm over 6 weeks, the measured, deliberate pace of a woman who had spent years moving quietly through spaces that didn't belong to her and had now, finally, arrived in one that did. Serafina entered the war room. She was carrying a leather portfolio, the legal documents confirming the full restoration of the Vale estate, signed that morning by Chancellor Sterling. She set it on the table, on top of the pencil lines, on top of the map of a conspiracy that had defined both their lives and was now, officially, resolved. "It's done," she said. "It's done." They stood across the table from each other, the same positions they had occupied on the first day she entered this room. Him on one side, her on the other, the evidence between them. But the distance was different now, not the calculated gap of a duke maintaining protocol and a displaced heir maintaining self-protection. Something closer. Something that had been built over 6 weeks of shared work, shared risk, and the particular intimacy of 2 people who had seen each other's architecture exposed and hadn't looked away. "The Vale estate is fully restored," Serafina said. "The agricultural corridor is back under Vale control. The legal title is clean. I can return to my father's lands and begin reconstruction." "You can." A pause. "I'm not going to," she said. Lucien looked at her. Her hair had grown out enough to touch her collar. The scar on her jawline was visible, as always. Her hands, still calloused, still carrying the physical evidence of 9 years of survival, rested on the portfolio with a steadiness that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with certainty. "The Vale estate needs a regent to manage reconstruction while I oversee the broader legal recovery," she said. "I've appointed Edmund's recommendation, a land steward from the Eastern Holdings with 30 years of agricultural experience. He'll do a better job than I would from that distance." "And you?" "I'm staying. Here. Here." The words settled into the room, into the stone walls, into the war table with its pencil marks, into the space between 2 people who had arrived at this moment through separate paths of damage and reconstruction and had discovered, somewhere in the wreckage, that the strongest structures are not the ones built from isolation. They are the ones built from the deliberate, terrifying, architecturally unsound decision to let someone else bear weight alongside you. Lucien walked around the table. He stopped in front of her, close enough that the distance between them was no longer strategic. It was personal. It was a choice. "You should know," he said, "that I am not an easy man. I am controlling, obsessive, and I process emotion through strategic frameworks because the alternative terrifies me. I have spent my entire life building walls, and 3 weeks ago I agreed to tear them down, and I am still learning what that means. I will get it wrong. Frequently. And I will occasionally revert to being the most difficult person in any room I enter." "I know. And you're staying anyway." "I'm not staying anyway. I'm staying because of that. Because you just told me who you are instead of performing who you want me to see. That's the only thing I've wanted from anyone since I was 16 years old." Lucien's hand rose, slowly, The hand of a man who has commanded armies and dismantled conspiracies and governed a dominion with absolute authority, reaching toward a woman's face with a hesitation that belonged to someone doing something for the first time. His fingers touched her jaw. The scar. The physical record of everything she had endured. She didn't pull away. "I spent 9 years learning to survive without anyone," she said. Her voice was quiet. "I'm going to need time to learn how to survive with someone." "I know. And I will get it wrong. Frequently, I imagine." Something happened to her face. Not a smile. Neither of them traded in those as a primary currency, but a softening. The relaxation of muscles that had been held in defensive configuration for so long that releasing them felt like a structural event. "Frequently," she agreed. He kissed her. In the war room. Beneath the high windows where morning light was cutting through the fortress walls. On top of the pencil marks and the legal documents and the archived evidence of a conspiracy that had tried to erase them both. He kissed her, and it was not the kiss of a duke claiming what was his. It was the kiss of a man who had finally understood that the most terrifying act of power is not dominance. It is surrender, not the surrender of defeat, the surrender of allowing another person past the architecture, into the unfinished rooms where the construction is ongoing and the foundation is still settling. She kissed him back. With the ferocity of a woman who had kept herself sealed for 9 years and had decided in this room with this man that the risk was worth the wreckage if the wreckage came. They stood together in the war room of Blackthorn Keep. The fortress was quiet around them. The Dominion was quiet beyond its walls. The aristocratic world that had been shaken by scandal and investigation and the spectacular public destruction of a 30-year conspiracy was settling into its new configuration. One where the Duke of Ravenshire was no longer alone, and the woman standing beside him was no longer invisible, and the covenant between two dead men had finally, after years of sabotage and silence, been honored. Later that evening, they walked through the library. The portrait of their fathers hung above the central fireplace. 2 men standing side by side, painted decades ago, when promises were made in ink and trust was something you gave to the people who earned it. Serafina stopped beneath the portrait. She looked up at her father's face, the softer jawline, the thoughtful eyes, the expression of a man who had believed that his word and his ally's word would be enough to protect his daughter. "He would have liked you," she said to Lucien. "He would have found me insufferable." "That too." She paused. "But he would have trusted you. And he would have been right." Lucien stood beside her. He looked at the portrait, at his own father's angular features, at the 2 men who had made a promise in this room, in this house, in the belief that the families they built would honor the words they signed. The promise had been broken. It had been buried, corrupted, weaponized, and nearly destroyed. And then it had been kept. Not by the men who made it, by the people they left behind, by a duke who discovered that the architecture of power is incomplete without the capacity for trust, by a woman who discovered that the architecture of survival is incomplete without the willingness to be found, by 2 people who met across a conspiracy designed to keep them apart and built something from the wreckage that was stronger than anything the wreckage had destroyed. The library was quiet. The fortress was quiet. The Dominion of Ravenshire stretched beyond its walls, vast, prosperous, governed by a man who was no longer alone in the rooms where the decisions happened. Lucien Blackthorn looked at Serafina Vale in the firelight and understood, with the structural certainty that had always been his greatest strength and his deepest limitation, that the most important thing he had ever built was not the Dominion, not the alliances, not the political empire that bore his name. It was the space between 2 people who had agreed to stop building walls. The kingdom would remember the scandal. The history books would record the investigation, the trial, the restoration. Scholars would debate the political implications for generations. But the fortress remembered something simpler. The sound of 2 people laughing in a war room at midnight, surrounded by documents and pencil marks, and the quiet, astonishing aftermath of choosing each other over everything that had ever tried to keep them apart. That was enough. That was more than enough. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, locations, and circumstances are products of the imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or real events is purely coincidental.